Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the STP training webinar, which is Automate Responsive Websites Tests with Galen. Our speaker for the day is Pranathi Birudugadda. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester myself, and I'm excited to host you all and Pranathi on our STP training webinars. So we just got done with our Spring 2018 STP conference, and we are now already working towards our next upcoming one, which is Fall 2018 STP Con. This will be held at Arlington, Virginia from October 22nd to 25th this year. The good news is that the call for papers is still open until the 27th April, that is this Friday. So if you are interested in speaking with us, please do visit our site at stpcon.com and submit accordingly. Remember, the CFP ends day after tomorrow, so not much time left there. Another quick piece of information that I have for you is that there is an upcoming webinar, Let's Get Real, about the test automation using a context-driven approach. This is by Lee Barnes on 9th of May. Lee is the founder and CTO of Utopia Solutions. The link is already up for you to review and register, so go for it. And if you are on Twitter, please share the conference information and about this webinar with your followers, connections. You can also add STP's Twitter handle on your tweets, which is SoftwareTestPro. You can also note down the speaker's Twitter handle, which is mentioned here, just in case you need it later. And right before we start, a few housekeeping points for next 1 hour. All the attendees shall remain muted through the webinar. You can type in your questions and share them with us through your question box. We shall take them up once Pranathi is done with her presentation. The webinar shall be recorded and posted on the SoftwareTestPro site for the attendees to go through later. All right, so let's get started with the webinar today. A very warm welcome, Pranathi. We are very thrilled to have you with us today, and let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Pranathi is a senior quality analyst with the ThoughtWorks Technologies. She's a young techie who describes herself as quality enthusiast. She has played the roles of quality analysts, business analysts, and is always willing to explore different roles in the IT industry. She actively learns and shares different testing tools and technologies. In her free time, she explores the latest trends in testing and pitches those for the use in the projects. She has worked on automation, mobile, performance, and security testing. She's a passionate engineer who actively participates in educating and providing guidance to the graduate women about career options in IT. She has done various sessions on agile practices in colleges and at conferences. All right, Pranathi, a very warm welcome once again, and the floor is all yours now. I'm going to share your screen.
Thank you, Smita. Hello, everyone. Actually, greetings from Berlin. Right now, I'm in Berlin, and it's 6 p.m. So I hope if my voice sounds tired, just so you know, I just had a long day at work, and I'm now gathering all my energy to give this talk to you folks, so you take away something from this session. So welcome again. This session is about automating responsive websites. How do we test the responsive website, and what is the best way to test them? A little about me, I guess. Smita did speak about me in a bunch, so I'm not going to go into details about what I do. But those are my social networking handles. If you want to reach out to me for any questions or any inputs or suggestions, please feel free to drop me a message. So to begin with, what is a responsive web design? So for those of you who have been hearing about responsive web design so far, cut short 20 years back, there was no concept of responsive web design, right? If you look at the way software development happened 20 years back, there used to be one website which goes www.domain.com, which is like the whole content of a company or content of a product that is displayed on that website, and people would just use a desktop or a big monitor where they visit www.domain.com and see the content on the screen. Back then, mobiles were very simple, right? We have Nokia 3120 where you just dial the number and make a call. It was just used for making calls. But then BlackBerry came in and it sort of changed the whole game. The way mobile is looked at has been totally changed. Then people realized they could do even better using just the mobile phones, not just making calls. And then people started designing websites for mobile so people can look at the websites on mobiles itself. If you remember, back then we used to have www.domain.com to visit on bigger screens like a laptop or like a desktop. But if you go to mobile, you used to visit something like m.domain.com, which means it's customized for a mobile view. This has become a huge pain for the developers because even though it's just the same content, they have to develop it for two different platforms. One is the desktop and the other is the mobile. And they have to write two different code bases and maintain these two different code bases, which has become even bigger pain for software development. So the concept of responsive web design is to eliminate that pain and make it simpler, make it easier to have single code base that can be rendered on any screen. So that's what a responsive website means. A website that can adjust based on the screen resolution, the user's screen resolution. Um, so the other advantages that we get here is you can just write once and it can work on any resolution. You don't have to worry about what type of screen the user might be using, or should I worry for a particular resolution or something like that. And this is heavily achieved by using the CSS3 media queries, where you can define a particular range for which a particular range of resolution and say how your screen is going to appear in that range of resolution. Um, that's one of the best outcomes of responsive website. To explain further what I meant, I would like to quickly show you the STPCon website, because that's one of the best examples for responsiveness. So if you look at the website right now, you see a really nice header and a really nice picture, and then there are these two blocks where you have the dates and the location. This is the mobile. This is the desktop view. Now, what happens when we shrink this website? When I say I don't have this big of a screen, I have a smaller screen. So you can notice that the contents on the website are adjusting when you resize the browser. So this is exactly what a responsive website behavior looks like. So you're adjusting the layout based on the end user screen resolution. So how is it achieved? Like how does this happen? Um, so the basic concept behind responsive web design is, instead of thinking of your website like a newspaper, which is a fixed width and length, think of it as a flexible grid. If you divide your website into a graph, which is like really stretchable, flexible, and then you sort of align the elements on the website based on the flexibility. Sometimes your images might be bigger or images might be smaller depending on what size you're using. The other thing that you do is use different image sizes instead of just one big image size. And like I mentioned, the CSS3 media queries also help doing this. So this is a quick animation to show how the responsiveness address. So you can see different elements aligning based on the resolution of the screen. If it's in landscape mode or portrait mode, and what's important can come to the top, and what's not important can go to the bottom, etc. Now, we spoke about responsive website, how it's built, but with everything that's being developed also comes the challenge on how do you test it? How do you make sure it's working fine? So let's talk a little bit about responsive web design testing. So when we talk about the responsive web design testing, and when we talk about the different resolutions and different screen sizes, as you can see in the picture, the first and foremost problem is which device to test, which resolution to test. In this market on current trends, there's new device in the market. There is a new device every day in the market with different resolution. There is no particular standard size that you could expect. So this is one of the biggest challenges that you can expect when you try to test a responsive website. Now, how do we get through that? How do we get away from these challenges? So this is sort of framework that I keep in my mind when I do the responsive website testing. So this is something that I found out helpful for me from my personal experience, and this might vary for you based on your project requirements or project priorities. But basically, what you can do is you can divide the testing into four different buckets. The first thing is the first thing I would always check is pages should be readable on all resolutions. This is very important when you're talking about the font sizes or the image sizes on the page. It might so happen that you have really huge text on a desktop version, but you don't want a huge font of 40 pixel on a mobile. It should be smaller so it fits the screen and it's readable. What I mean by that is, for example, if I can quickly show you this screen, which is ThoughtWorks website, you see this huge text which says always inventing and always delivering. That's the first thing that catches your eye when you enter the website. And we don't want the same size on the mobile because it might take up so much, it will take up all of the space on the mobile screen if it's that huge. So it should just be readable, but it should still be the thing that people can pay attention to. Like I said, the second thing that I would keep in mind is content that is defined as important should be visible in all breakpoints. What I mean by this is, for certain businesses, the content that is displayed on the website, some of it is really important, while some of it is like a footer may not be the first thing the user sees. But sometimes business requirement says, oh, when a user lands on this page, I want them to see this shiny new image. So they click on it and then they buy that article, or they click on it and then they register. So content that is defined as important for the business should be visible in all breakpoints. Um, Next, moving on, the another important aspect is text, controls, images, color, shading, etc. What I mean by this is, if your page has a form, it has to be usable on every resolution. If you are a user of an Android and iPhone, you must have noticed that the form, the way it works, differs based on the OS that the mobile has. iPhone has one way of showing the form fill options, whereas Android has something else. So these are the different resolutions that we are talking about. So on your desktop, the way the form displayed will be different from the way it is displayed on a mobile. But this is something that's important. The text and the controls are really important, and they should be rendered properly. And the other important thing is the coloring. You need to make sure whatever the branding is being used for the website is being rendered correctly on all the resolution. So those would be the next two things that you need to keep in mind while testing. Like I mentioned, these are the four priority things that I would look for when I'm testing the responsive website. These are not the only things that we should be looking for, but these are the most important things that we should be looking for. All right. So let's talk about some of the common challenges that we have when we talk about responsive website. The very first thing is, what are all the devices that I need to select to test, or what are all the resolutions that I need to select to test my application? Like, how would I know which resolution is the priority to test? And the second one is frequent change of requirements. If you are working in an agile environment, or if you're working on a product where the requirements are frequently changing because of the business reasons or the end user requirements or something like that, you have to keep testing the same thing over and over again to make sure your responsiveness is not broken, which becomes a really huge pain if you are doing just the manual testing on all the devices or all the resolutions. So these three are like the most common challenges that we find. So how do we come across, like, how do we overcome these challenges? The first thing that I've noticed for selecting the resolutions is having resolution buckets that you can cater to instead of worrying about each and every resolution. Like I mentioned, how the CSS media query works, you define a range. Say if it's anything about 1200 pixel width, it's a desktop, Anything between 980 to 1200 is my tablet, and anything below 980 is my mobile resolution. So you define these three different buckets and test for those buckets and those edge cases and make sure that everything is working fine within the bucket. So if it works fine between 480 pixel to 940 pixel, I'm pretty sure usually most mobiles use that resolution, so it should be good for all the mobile resolutions. Similarly for the tablet, similarly for the desktop. So that's how you define it into buckets and test using the equivalence partitioning or all the testing techniques that we have heard about, doing the boundary analysis, testing for the edge cases, the border cases, make sure nothing is broken in the borders, etc. So that's one way of doing it. And to tackle with manual testing, there are a bunch of tools that are available out in the market which will help you sort of reduce this testing effort. Instead of just using your eyes on the monitor and hands on the keyboard, you could also make use of these tools that are available to reduce the effort. So the very first thing that I've seen is a responsive web design tester. It's a plugin on Chrome, which you can use to just resize the browser to whatever resolution you want. You can also use Chrome's inbuilt screen resolution. I'll just quickly show that to you. So this is how Chrome works. If you see here, it says toggle device toolbar, which is an option that lets you select in which resolution you want to look at your website. So you could just say, I want to look at 600 by 840 or something and see how my page renders or something like that. So this is inbuilt in Chrome, and there's an alternative for this in Firefox as well. There are also other tools available which sort of help you automate this testing instead of just doing it manually. One of the top examples are Browser Stack, Apply Tools, Galen Framework, and then there are web online solutions that are available where you just enter your web URL and then it just takes the screenshots on different resolution and gives you a report on where it is looking good or where it's broken. So for today's session, we are going to discuss about Galen Framework. So Galen Framework is one of my favorite tools. A, because it's open source. B, because it's so easy to learn. The learning curve for Galen Framework is very simple and very easy. You'll see why. To talk a little bit about Galen, it was developed by Ivan Shubin, and it's open source, like I mentioned. And the main goal of this tool was to help testing responsive websites. And Galen also uses Selenium in the background to open the browser and do the testing. All right. So how does Galen work? So remember how I mentioned dividing your resolutions into different buckets? That is something the concept even Galen uses too. So first you define a set of resolutions that you want to test for. And then we write something called a spec file, which defines how your website should look in that particular resolution. And once you run the spec file, Galen will open the browser. It will resize the browser to your specified dimension, and then it verifies the spec files. Galen can also be used on Selenium Grid, which means you can actually run it on multiple resolutions or run it in parallel, run it on a server, whichever automation powers you can use with Selenium automation, the functional automation, you can use the same power to do the UI automation, the responsiveness automation. So a little bit about Galen spec file. So Galen spec file is nothing but a basic a file that contains information or your description of how the website should look like. So on this spec file, you might say, my page header should be at the top of the page, and it should have a height of 10 pixel, and it should have a text of blah, or it should be of color red, color blue, or something. So you define the layout of each and every element on your website, and you put that in the spec file. And this is pretty easy. The spec file is written in a simple English language, so it's very easy to put it in place, easy to read, and easy to understand. Also, because it's very simple to write because it uses minimal text. I can let's see a quick example. So this is a typical example of a Galen spec file. So if you see at the top, I define something called objects, and these objects are nothing but the way to identify your web elements. So I defined something called header, and I said it find header using a CSS, and I provided what the CSS is. And and now I'm saying this header on desktop, the width is 100% of viewport, which means it should occupy the 100% width, and the height is approximately 105 pixel. And on the mobile, the header is still 100% width, but the height is now just 55 pixel. So it's very easy to read, very easy to write, and very easy to understand. You might also notice that tags that I'm using, which says @ on desktop and @ on mobile. So this is Galen's way of understanding what resolution it should be verifying this particular header on. So when I say desktop, in my Galen config file, I would say desktop means 1400 pixel to 1980 pixel width. Mobile is 480 pixel to 960 pixel width, etc. So that's how Galen recognizes, okay, whenever there's a tag at the mobile, I should open the browser for a particular size and then do the validation. Let's talk about Galen spec language. So the one that I showed you in the previous slide is just a little bit of sample on how a spec file looks like, and it has several other things that fall under this category. So the first one we saw is the object definition and then the tagging. So the other things that you could also use in a spec file are relative positions, which means you can say my image is at the top, or my button is below the header, or this link is near the footer, etc. So you can use these relative positions to define your layout, which makes it much easier to write and to read. You can also define the alignment. You could say if there are three different blocks on your website, you can say those three blocks are vertically aligned or horizontally aligned, or etc. etc. You can define all these alignments. You could also use height and width to write the spec file to define the layout. You could also test for the color scheme, which means you could say header text should be color white and the background should be color blue, something like that. You could also do image comparison using using Galen framework, which makes it much easier when you want to just uh, write a layout testing for a company logo or a banner that you know is going to be a static file. You could also test the CSS properties, which I sort of covered, which means you could test the font, you could test the styling, you could test the color, etc. So I'll just show you a simple demo on how this looks like. So if you can see the screen, this is an example of my spec file. I hope you can see the font. So this is the spec file that I've written for my ThoughtWorks website. So if you see, I've defined header. I've defined the central part, and I've defined some of the articles as objects in my spec file. So there's header, logo, header menu, Uber title, and how they're gonna. These are the objects that I use to identify them on my website. And there's also article block, which I was talking about, which are these blocks. And then I said footer, which is basically the footer. So I picked up these elements, and now I started defining the layout. So here I said for header on desktop, it should contain logo. It should contain a menu, which you can see. This is the menu that I'm talking about. This is the header menu. which has clients, services, products, etc. It talks about all these items on the menu. And then I said it has to have a width of 960 pixel and height of 77 pixel. And header menu should always be visible. And this header menu, if I can quickly show you, if you see this menu here, it has all these options, all these pages, like the clients link, services link, products link. And if I try and shrink this, and if it goes to mobile view, you can see that the menu is collapsed into a hamburger, which is at the top right. So that's why I've defined a header menu and a mobile menu. So what I said is on desktop, header menu should be visible. And if it's on mobile, the header bar is absent and mobile menu is visible. Similarly, I've defined how my Uber title should look like, and I said it should be visible. That's what I'm worried about. That's what is important for me. I should be able to see that no matter if it's a desktop or mobile, which you can see here. This is the Uber title, which says always inventing, always delivering, which is sort of really important content for me. And I said that should be visible. And then I've given layout for article section. If you see here, the article blocks, they're aligned horizontally when it's on desktop, and while on mobile, they are vertically aligned. So if you see, these are the article blocks, which are horizontally aligned. And if I go to mobile view, they are vertically aligned. And then the footer section, no matter what device or what resolution, it should always be visible. So this is my simple spec file. So now we have written the spec file. What do we do with the spec file? So there's a simple Galen command which checks the spec file, which looks something like Galen check, and you give the file name, and you give the URL and the size, and then you say what are all the tags to be included, which is sort of a lengthy command to remember. To help with it, there's something simple called as test file. So what the test file does is it contains all the information about your with resolutions, your URL that you want to deal with, and the file name. So if you look at it, I said I defined a table of devices, and I said device name, what is the tag that I used on my spec file, and what is the size when I talk about this tag, this particular device name. So I said mobile, and the tags will be whichever tagged as mobile or whichever tagged as all, and the size will be 414 by 736. Similarly, if it's tagged as desktop, you have the size as 1280 by 10224. So here I defined, so here parameterize means it's going to use the parameters from the table that we have defined. Devices is the name of the table. So we take these parameters, and this is something like a readable comment. We said ThoughtWorks homepage on $device name, which is mobile or desktop. So I defined the URL, and I got the variable size, which is from the device table. And I said, check thoughtworks.gspec, which is my spec file. And I said, include my tags, which I'm passing here. So let's quickly run this file and see what happens. So this is my Galen test command. So this is my Galen test command. If you see, I said Galen test thoughtworks.test, which is the file name. And then I've given the path for my Chrome driver, which I'm doing it from the terminal. You can also edit it in a Galen config file, which is something that I will show you a little bit later. And then I said, save HTML reports in a folder HTML-report. Now let's run this command and see what happens. So now I ran the command. Galen opens a browser and it's resizing it for mobile, and then it's doing a bunch of validations. And similarly, it's doing for another resolution that I mentioned, which is desktop. Now, let's see. So if you quickly look at it here, we have a nice log which says header section, header bar, etc., etc., and then Uber title, etc., etc., and then it has done a bunch of validations. And if you see, the status is pass, and there are 2 tests, no failures, no failed test. Let's quickly look at the report that is generated. So Galen also helps you creating these nice reports where you can see what are all the tests that are being run. So if I open this, expand all, so this is the bunch of checks that it has performed. So the header bar contains, so if you see, it actually highlights the elements that it's looking for and what is the validation that you've been doing. So I said header bar should contain logo and header menu. So it said, yes, header bar, I found it, and I found the logo and I found the header menu, and they both are inside the header bar. Similarly, I said header menu visible, and Galen was able to find it, so it says yes, visible. Similarly, Uber title, etc. So this is on desktop, and similar checks are performed on mobile too. So I said on mobile, header bar should be absent. It couldn't find any header bar on the UI. So it says, yes, it's passed. And then I said it should contain mobile logo, mobile menu. So if you see, it has found those elements and it said, yep, they are inside it. So it's passed. Similarly, it does all the checks for articles, footer, etc. Well, what's fun if just to see the passing test, right? Let's make a test fail and see how Galen verifies it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my spec file and say header menu absent. I'm saying on my desktop header menu should be absent, which is not the case because it should be visible. So let's see what Galen does when I do that. I'm going to quickly run the command again and let it run the tests. All right. Let's see the status. It says your tests have failed. So it says total 2 tests, 1 failed. And if you see here, it says you said header menu should be absent, but it's not absent on the page. So I'm failing. Let's also take a look at the report to see how it looks like. So if you look at the report now, it generates this nice screenshot where it says like the layout says the header menu should be absent, but it's actually visible and it's here. So I'm failing, and then it just fails. And you could see that one of the tests have failed. Yep. So like I mentioned, the good features that come with Galen is error reporting. You can get a HTML file or a JSON file, which you can use to just look at and understand why your tests have failed. You also get the nice screenshots where it's highlighting the elements, and it's very easy to read the reports. You can also do image comparison, which I haven't done in my spec file, but like I mentioned, if you want to compare a static image like a logo or something, we can use the image comparison to do the verification for those. Something that I haven't covered here is warning levels and custom errors. So what do I mean by warning levels is if you know something on the UI is going to be flaky, or some elements are going to be only visible. For example, there is an A by B testing, or a particular UI element is flaky, or etc. cases, you could define the level of warning. So you can tell Galen either to fail the test or just to warn and continue. That's something you can do. And similarly, it goes with the custom errors. Instead of just failing for everything, you could handle custom errors by defining your own rules. So yeah, that's all I have for the session. If you have any questions, you can ask now.
Hey, Pranathi, thank you so much for your insightful session on this. And yes, we do have a couple of queries. I'll
Mhm.
quickly ask them. Yeah. Okay. So the first one is every page in your application is associated with a GSpec file, it
Yeah.
seems. Yeah. So is Galen framework limited to visual validation or functional testing can be implemented too?
Um, it's a really good question. You could do a functional validation using Galen, but if we talk about test pyramid, Selenium provides you various features to do the functional testing, and what's lacking in Selenium is the visual validation. And if I were to pick Galen, I would pick it to do the visual validation and keep it simple, keep it short and sweet, so it gives me really fast feedback just on my UI and avoid the functional validation. But to answer the question, it does that, but I strongly feel that it might not be the best way to use Galen.
Okay. Another quick question is from Vamsi, and he says, "Is this open source?" Which I think it is. You mentioned it at the start.
Yeah.
Uh, Compared to Apply tools, what advantages does this have?
So I've used Apply tools right in the beginning when it was still in experimental stage. One of the biggest advantage which I mentioned while I was talking about Galen is the learning curve. It's really simple learning curve. You don't have to have a coding background. You don't have to worry about writing a Java code or any language code. All you need to know is writing plain English simple spec file and follow the syntax and the keywords, which makes it really easy for anyone who wants to just learn Galen to start with it and write spec file and test their website, which also means that the cost of investment is very less, but the fruit is much bigger.
Fair enough. Um, okay, there is a question here which says that you have not been able to go through the how to put Chrome driver into the config file. So there's a request if you could go over that.
Yeah, definitely. I'll show that in a bit if you don't have any other questions.
Okay, so I'll just first let's get through the other queries and then we'll go back to that one.
Yeah.
F- what if some pages are based on roles and credentials? How can I pass that in the test?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, Galen is using Selenium WebDriver in the background, which in turn uses JavaScript executor. So, one thing we can do is write a JavaScript file, which basically finds the fields and enters the data into it and does the action on the screen. So you find your username field, password field, enter the details, click on submit, which basically finishes the authentication or finishes the login process. And you can inject that JavaScript file at any particular step in the Galen spec file. So after you do the validation, then you run the JavaScript file, and then you navigate to a welcome screen after the login, and then you continue with another spec file which can be defined in your test file.
Okay. So a bit related query, but and I know you have explained this earlier, but just to reiterate,
Mhm.
um, the question is, can you go through the setup flow for this? Do we need to just import a library into an existing Java project, or is there something else?
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So Galen is pretty simple to install. All you have to do is download the zip file, extract it, and run the install.sh file, which basically installs Galen on your machine. So I'm assuming if this question is to include it in the test framework, you could do the same that you would do to download Selenium or Cucumber or any other testing tool. You could write your scripts, the build automation scripts that actually download Galen and install it on that machine. The installation is really simple. And once Galen is available on the machine, you could just run the spec file. I hope that answers the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another question is, how do we know that these are the attributes for Galen framework, like visible, absent, etc.?
Yeah. So Galen framework comes with all the spec language. It's available on the Galen website. Like what are all the keywords that needs to be used, etc. Visible is something that's really commonly used, but there are several other keywords that are available in that website.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is more about functional, which we have already mentioned that we can use it for functional as well as visual testing.
Mhm.
Um, is there any metrics on flakiness?
Mm, I'm not sure I understand the question currently.
I believe it is on the flakiness of automation, but I don't think there exists one right away like this. But is there something you use for flakiness and automation, like how good or bad your automation is?
Um, I guess this is something very depending on the situation sort of question. So
Mm-hmm.
I would, like I mentioned, the moment I see something failing, I would tag it. I would I would put a custom warning level on it, and I would let my UI developer or someone who is some developer on the team to take a look at it and reduce the flakiness of that particular UI element. Because when we are talking about the visual impact of this particular website or a product, right? It's really important because we don't accept any flakiness on the website, so it's really of high importance to me. So the moment my Galen tests are flaky, it's a big red flag for the team.
Correct. It will be mostly context driven, like you said, basis which situation we are in. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Another question here, and I'm not sure if you would be aware of it right away, but the question is, what are the big player using Galen, like the Galen framework? And I think I mean, the suggestion is from Rodrigo is saying, I think it's mostly used by news websites, but are you aware, like, which are the big players who are actually using Galen framework?
Uh, Not that I know of. To be frank, Galen is something that's been recently gaining popularity. It's been there just for like 3 years now, and it's not as popular because to be frank, the people who are actively working on Galen, it's just a handful of people. It's like 10 or 12 people who are actively developing it. So they don't do big marketing and stuff. I accidentally stumbled upon this tool. So it's not something that's out in the market. People are pushing for it. It's like I mentioned, it's an open source tool available there for people who want to use it. Um, but yeah, it could make a really powerful tool if someone wants to pick it up and work on it.
Okay. Uh, and again, I'm getting a query regarding the recording. Yes, guys, this is all getting recorded and it will be there on SoftwareTestPro.com for you to go through it again. And Rick and James will be emailing you the same to all the attendees. So please don't worry. Okay, the next question is, what is the huge difference between Galen and Selenium?
Uh, like I mentioned, so Selenium is really powerful tool for anyone to do the functional automation. And when it comes to the layout testing, the the expanse to which you can do UI validation is very limited. So you could do something like, oh, this element is visible or selected or clickable or absent, etc. But you cannot say this particular element is in this particular position on the page, or it's at the top left or top right. It requires more coding when you're doing it using Selenium. You need to define the coordinates and give the dimensions to say on this page at this particular point is my element present, etc., which is just adding the complexity to your functional tests. So the way Galen does it is it makes it even simpler by providing an additional layer. It's taking away all this pain from you to write these custom definitions to say when it's on top right or top left. So you could just use that keyword and say top right or bottom or left. or horizontally aligned, etc. So you're just like abstracting whatever the calculation that needs to be done, and you're just using the simpler system.
So that brings me to my under question, Pranti. Then, how do you actually measure Galen versus the image comparison tools which are now emerging these days?
Yeah. So one of my pet peeves with image comparison tools is that they are so I can only use image comparison tools when I know my website is going to be static, that my content is not going to be changing, and I know that this is the content and this content is going to be there like for next 1 month at least, that I can do the image comparison, because I don't want to go back and keep changing my base image, right? And nowadays it's very common that websites have more dynamic content rather than a static content. There might be a carousel, there might be an ad or a banner that comes up on the website, which makes it hard for you to like keep changing your base image every time there is a change on the UI. So you have to like have a big directory of base image when there's no ad, base image when there is ad, etc., etc., which makes it really hard, right? Like you need to keep track of all your screenshots and compare those screenshots every time. But if you just have an automation tool, it's just like adding one more sentence saying that this particular element is visible or absent. If it's visible, great. If it should be absent, then just say absent, and you're good, and that'll run, which makes it easier for like updating your tests.
Yeah, makes so much sense. Yes, actually. All right. So here's our next question that says, what is the best way to set up the spec file? To set up a spec file, PWEP web page seems a daunting task if your application has a number of web pages.
Hmm. So I'm gonna like I did not get that completely, but what
Yeah.
I understood is if it has multiple web pages, then you will have multiple spec files. Is that a good way? I guess that's what it is. Um, Well, I think that sort of minimizes your trouble if you divide your spec file based on your web pages, because you know as soon
Yeah.
as your spec file fails, you know which page
Sorry.
it's failing.
Sorry to interrupt, Pranti. Yes, she does mean to set up a spec file per web page seems a daunting task. So, especially if you have a lot of web pages. So, is there any other way to set up the spec file?
Um, so yeah, like I was mentioning, it's better to have a different spec file for a web page, just so you are different. You are like avoiding the failures, because you don't want to fail your entire test suite where only one page is failing. This is just like the way of avoiding dependencies between the web pages, right? It is not a daunting task, especially given that you can also use import to import the objects that you're defined in some other spec file. So you don't have to like repeat the things that you're writing in one spec file in another spec file. There's even more things that I couldn't cover in the session, but if you go to Galen website, you can see how you can import a spec file into another spec file, or a part of spec file definitions into another spec file, so you're not repeating yourself while you're writing the spec file, which makes it easier.
Hmm. So, can we implement this framework on mobile sites too, on mobile apps, more importantly, or is it just for the web apps?
Um, to be frank, I haven't tried it on a mobile app. Mostly, uh, I guess it should be applicable, because I've seen someone on GitHub mention that they have used it on a mobile, where they've actually hooked it up to a real mobile device and tested it on the app. I personally haven't tried it, but I've heard from people that it actually works.
Okay. Um okay. So, a lot of questions around visual test tools and frameworks and comparison.
Mhm.
Under one here is how far a page can be tested. So, it's from Vaishnavi, and what she's trying to say is uh, the depth to which that makes sense to test based on like on your experience. Is that advisable to test almost all the elements of the page, or what should be the suggested limit?
So if I go back to the slide that I was showing about what are my important things that I would test on a browser. So test, it's basically a question about testing, right? When do we say testing is completed? Testing is never done. I guess that's applicable for everything that we tend to do. So I would try to define what's most important for me on my layout and just limit my testing to that to begin with, you know. And once I know these things are stable, then I would look for what else can I make sure is covered, and what are my pain points that I have to keep doing again and again and reduce those pain points. But yeah, this goes back to the every test is philosophical question. Like I said, when do we say it's done?
So it's really depending upon what is your purpose to do it and how much you yourself want to do it. Context
Yeah,
driven.
exactly.
Yeah. All right. Pranti, I'll just take a last query here, which is about what are the online resources where you can, one can go to look for Galen help.
Oh, so you could very much go to the Galen Framework website, which is this one, galenframework.com. It basically has everything that you want to know, where you can download, and it has every information that you would need. It just tells you the syntax, how to write a test file, etc., etc. So, yep, Galen Framework website.
And I will let you now quickly show the attendees how to put Chrome driver into the config file.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Galen config file is something that looks like this. So this is a generated config file. So the moment you say Galen config in it, it generates a file like this, which has a bunch of options that lets you to configure Galen. So if you see some of the important things here, maybe a default browser. You could define what is the default browser that you want to test. Is it Chrome, or is it Firefox, or is it something else, Safari, etc.? So you can say this is really useful, especially when you want to run your tests on parallel on different VMs, where you have different Galen config file for everything. One slave can be just used to run Firefox tests, and one slave can be just used to run Chrome tests, etc. So this is where you define your browser, and this is where we provide the browser path. Similarly, there are other things that you can see here. For example, to set up the Selenium grid, how you can you can define your Selenium grid. You can provide the URL and the browser and the version and platform, and these are mapped to the Selenium grid, and then the Galen runs the test based on that. And yeah, like I said, there is just like bunch of tests, a bunch of options that are there in the config file, for which you get a detailed explanation on the Galen website. So if you see this configuration, it talks about all the things that you can do. So this is how we set up the Gecko driver path, Chrome path, etc. So like I said, this session is basically an introductory session, so people get familiarized with this too. And it's up to you to just go to the website and see, pick the things that work for you and start working.
Awesome. Um, Thanks, Pranti. And quickly, if you could tell us that is this compatible with Internet Explorer and Edge?
It did work with Internet Explorer. I haven't tried with Edge yet because uh, we haven't tried for Edge. But yeah, it's applicable with Internet Explorer, at least from my experience. Yeah.
Very nice. All right. So thank you so much, Pranti. It was such an engaging session and so insightful. I'm sure all our attendees found it very informative and useful. So thank you again, and I hope to see you in Virginia for the STP Fall
Thank
2018.
you. Thank you so much for for everyone that attended. I hope this was helpful and informative.
Yeah. So, well, everyone, this concludes our webinar for today. Thanks for joining, and most importantly, thanks for being so engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and for the whole group. If you want to see more such sessions and learn more about such automation, do come over to STPCon Fall 2018. And stay tuned for more webinars and online trainings coming soon at SoftwareTestPro.com. And if you haven't signed up yet for the upcoming webinar, which is Let's Get Real About the Test Automation Using a Context-Driven Approach by Lee Barnes on 9th of May, then the link is up for registration at SoftwareTestPro.com. So go ahead. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week ahead. See you all in Virginia in October 2018. Have a great year ahead, all of you. Happy learning.